So thank you very much for both of you for giving us your time. Paul Kennedy from LK Law and Garth White with Avison Young Real Estate. And Garth's specialty is the industrial side with some commercial leanings, and of course has the entire program of what they do with their portfolio behind him for some information. So thank you very much for joining the chamber today to sort of help ask some of the questions around leases and commercial rent. May 1st has come and gone, and here we are. Now we're looking at, if people survived May 1st, we're looking at June 1st as another commercial rent, everybody rent to come up. And so from there, we will be putting forward, more information to the powers that be above us when it comes to a chamber. The feedback and input that we get on these different programs has been executed at higher levels quite quickly as a network. So for instance, this morning there was the announcement on the temporary expansion to layoffs, the time frame. That came directly from all of the feedback that the Chamber Network and other organizations had given to government as something that you're going to have to look at because it could bankrupt millions of companies. So with all these programs coming up and in place, thank you for taking the time to come and talk to us about this aspect of the situation. So Garth, did you want to just sort of talk a little bit about what you're running into out there right now? We had talked a little bit about how industrial's not as bad, but other areas are seeing the pinch.
Yeah, absolutely. I think I can kind of run through the different asset classes quickly and kind of, I guess, topical information on what I'm seeing. So I guess starting kind of with retail is obviously, the asset class is going to be probably impacted the most through this COVID pandemic, especially in closed shopping center malls. I think those will be the longest to kind of come back from this. That said, as a lot of opportunistic, larger international and national tenants are taking advantage of the situation, unfortunately. A lot of opportunity to lease space that's coming up in locations that hadn't been previously available. So I know the retail brokers in our office are quite busy, maybe not for the right reasons, but it is something that we are seeing. One thing that we will see is Canada's adoption for e-commerce was significantly lower than the US. And I think through this, I think a lot of people, like my parents, are buying things on Amazon now. I think you're going to see a lot more adoption and buy-in for e-commerce. So I think for businesses to succeed in long term, they really need to think about their online strategy. So I know a lot of groups, Innovative Fitness is a group that we've dealt with in the past, and they've shifted a lot to online to try and survive through this. So I think really want to see groups doing that. On the office side, I think it'll be really interesting to see what happens. I think a lot of groups are rethinking about how their office space works. And potentially if there's portions of their office that could potentially work from home full-time or part-time, you might see more kind of hoteling or shared workspace within an office where just kind of desks that rotate on schedules for people when they want to come in and out of the office. I think you also see a bit of a turn. I think the trend was the open concept office space, and we might see private offices as we work through this pandemic are probably going to be a safer situation. So you might see a turn back to more private offices. Generally speaking, though, I think our office market was really healthy, and I think will probably remain pretty consistent. On the industrial side, anything logistics, e-commerce, food production, all these groups are doing very well. The larger format space is still ticking along. I think if you drive out to some of the business parks, a lot of the parking lots are still fairly full, maybe less staff, but people are still operating. Thankfully, construction is still going in BC, which is a huge portion of our economy. Sentiment is probably going to be the smaller service industrial businesses that probably have the toughest time through this. The product that's coming through the Port of Metro Vancouver in April was really, really strong as far as volumes, and they're expecting May to be very slow. So I guess there's a bit of a lag in the supply that came. There's also expected to be an increase in demand for warehousing and yard storage because a lot of the consumer goods aren't being bought or taken up by consumers. So that will be interesting to see that play out. There's talk of onshoring of manufacturing for critical goods. So kind of preparing for the future Obviously being able to make masks and sanitizers, and will we see more of this being manufactured in Canada to
Garth,
protect us in the future?
can I touch on one thing when you hit right there? Do we have the industrial land base for that here?
We've got some land right now, but not a whole lot.
Okay.
I think for competitive reasons, obviously we've offshored a lot of this production because it's cheaper to do elsewhere. So I think if you see the onshoring of it, it's probably going to be in markets that are lower cost. So you might see production facilities in maybe Alberta or Manitoba, places like that where land values are a lot lower.
Okay.
Interestingly enough, oil is being stored anywhere possible to avoid bringing it to market. So huge swaths of lands are being taken up by essentially just tankers sitting there full of oil. So it doesn't make sense to bring to market currently. Yeah. General sentiment for industrial is fairly healthy long term. On the multifamily, I don't do a lot of multifamily, but I think that a lot of apartment building owners are in an interesting situation, having no leverage with the tenants. So a lot of tenants could reduce their or essentially pay zero rent, claim the $500 subsidy, and the landlord would have no recourse at all. So I think you might see some landlords in a pretty tough position because often these apartment buildings are fairly highly levered. So we will see what happens there. Couple things that conversations I'm having with tenants and clients and landlords. I think open communication right now is super important. I think if you're going to be in a position as a tenant where you're going to be asking for a deferral or a rent abatement, or for the landlord to participate in some of the programs available, you really need to provide background and story behind this. I think a lot of landlords are looking for this information and kind of proof of hardship, financials, if you're comfortable sharing them, to really illustrate how you're going to survive and what your business plan is to get through COVID. I think if you do that, your opportunity to get the buy-in from the landlord is significantly higher. Second piece of advice, and I've heard this from a lot of landlords: pay your rent as long as you can. If you're opting to just not pay rent out of the gates, they're going to be significantly less likely to work with you in the future. Obviously, if you can't pay rent, you can't pay rent. But I think if you can, I think it shows a goodwill and that you're trying to do what you can. Other interesting thing that we're seeing is what are called blend and extends. So if you're coming towards the end of your lease and your business is doing generally okay, what we're seeing is some groups approaching their landlords and saying, hey, we'd actually like to renew for a longer term. So say you have 1 year left on your lease, you could go to your landlord today and say, hey, I want to renew for 5 years. My business is still doing generally okay, but I want a bit of a rent reduction today to help me get through this situation. So giving the landlord a bit of certainty long term that you're going to be there, but also they're going to play ball with you a bit to get your rates down today to help work through the situation. That's kind of general update on my end.
So Paul, from the legal side, leases, a lot of people are I know one business, for instance, that had decided to expand prior COVID and then tried to get out of her new lease and was told, nope, this is the way it is. And of course, okay, fine. So heads down, she's going to run with it and open a secondary store. So, again, I think it comes down to communication, but what are you seeing from your side of it?
Yeah, absolutely. From the legal side of things, we're seeing communication and relationships as being what carry the day. If you've got that good, strong relationship with your landlord, they're going to be more receptive to your pitch. At the end of the day, the contracts are important. Of course, that's what we as lawyers do. For the most part, now force majeure is a term that a lot more people understand than a few short months ago. But at the end of the day, for the most part, your force majeure clause probably isn't going to help you as a tenant, and you're going to have to lean on that relationship that you have to try to get what you need in order to survive and make it through. The landlord's going through struggles just like you are, and if they see that you're coming to the table and you're making an effort, like Garth said, that's what they're looking for. The person who goes pens down and says tough luck, that guy's not going to get too much help.
No. So let's go to some of the questions that were submitted. So from your perspectives, both of you, what is the application process for the CECRA? I'm going to say it once, the Canadian Emergency Commercial Rent Assistance, and we're going to add program because there's somewhere in there. Require what landlords, they've kind of put the onus, no, they have put the onus on the landlords to take this on, and the landlords have to see, they're going to see a loss no matter what if they do this program. What are you generally hearing from landlords about this program?
So I haven't seen, rather they have not released the specifics on the application process yet. So the nitty-gritty details, the stuff that we like to see as lawyers, we can't sink our teeth into quite yet.
Okay.
It is absolutely apparently going to require landlord input. They're going to have to come to the table with their 25%. It seems like it's not optional at all, which is both a good thing and a bad thing, I suppose. To Garth's point, you know, if your tenant is turning out of his pocket, say, I can't afford to pay full boat rent. Okay, well, can you afford to pay 25%? Because if we get 25% from you and the landlord kicks in 25% from himself, and we get 50% from the government, well, that's better than $0.
Yeah. Garth?
Yeah, I mean, I think everyone's speculating on how many landlords are actually going to partake in this program. You know, I think early surveys are showing not that many. I think upwards of, I've heard 80% of landlords are not planning on participating, and you know, it's a bit of a tough situation, right? Because then it really becomes a very non-effective program, because it is, you know, landlord's option on whether they want to participate or not. You know, I think, you know, speaking to certain asset classes, again, this is, you know, devil's advocate, but landlords, you know, potentially are trying to get access to space, and maybe intentionally not participating in these programs. But, you know, I think it's a tough situation for everybody.
I had the luxury of being on a call with Minister Jolie federally last week with the Canadian Chamber, and I actually asked her the question. I said, you know, unfortunately, it seems like putting the onus of the entire project onto the landlord's lap seems to be a bit of a backwards or perhaps inefficient way to do it. And she did say, we're asking Canadians to come together, and we're asking Canadians to really look at this as a way to help each other. So she did say there's problems with the program. Of course, they hadn't finished the details. They hadn't rolled it out. They'd already marched back that morning on the mortgage versus unmortgaged buildings. So apparently, if you don't have a mortgage, you're still going to be able to apply to a help with rent. Originally, when they rolled it out, if you didn't have a mortgage, you couldn't even apply. So I think it's a hurry up and wait, as you've mentioned. So that actually just answered the other question, was do you have to have a mortgage on the property? Again, these things are changing. I actually made sure I was watching the Prime Minister this morning to see if they were making any new announcements on this program before we jumped on the call, because that can happen to us as well. So people are talking about if you could, in future, do you think that rents for businesses might become more affordable because of this situation? And if yes, do you have any suggestions on how landlords can manage capacity?
I think it'll depend. I think on the retail side, I think the small CRU, you will probably see, you know, more affordable rents. I think on office, I generally say it'll be about the same, would be my forecast. Industrial, I think, will be generally the same. You know, I think the supply and demand story for industrial is pretty telling. Obviously, we've mentioned that we have pretty limited land supply, so I think that there's going to be kind of continued pressure on that asset class. But yeah, I think retail will probably be the one where you're going to see the you know, maybe some lower rents in the future.
Okay. Especially if there's any of the larger chains that take this opportunity to not reopen. I know Canada hasn't had that much of an issue with that, but I know that in the States, there's some larger companies that were sort of borderline big box stores kind of thing that were having an issue before this and are now just saying, we're not going to reopen. You're seeing it in some of the smaller areas, people are deciding to retire.
Yeah.
You know, things like that are happening with some of those retail spaces. So that's an interesting one. Here in the Lower Mainland, commercial retail is some of the highest dollars in the country. Do you see this improving after rollouts and open ups? Will the supply outweigh the demand? Sorry, I'm asking the questions from the question that were submitted. So
Yeah, no worries. Yeah, I kind of same comments.
yeah. Can you explain the requirements? Paul, this one's over to you. Can you explain the requirements to cancel a lease that is now month to month?
Yeah, so this one is a little bit tricky to answer from a legal perspective without giving legal advice. So, first and foremost, if you're asking this question, you need to retain a lawyer, get specific legal advice about your specific situation. The exact terms of your contract are going to be relevant. And as we explain, the terms, your industry is going to be relevant, and the makeup of your lease. So firstly, what I'm giving now is not legal advice, just kind of general outline of things to look out for. And so the number one question is whether or not it's actually a month-to-month lease. So if you have a commercial lease that's standard form and it's written, and you're now overholding, you need to look at those terms and conditions to find out if the lease specifies that you're overholding as a month-to-month, or if not. A lot of the overholding terms will say specifically month-to-month, and the reason they do that is because if you are in what's called a lease for a term of years and it times out, you roll into a year-to-year lease. If you're in a lease for a term of months and it times out, absent other clauses, it rolls into a month-to-month. So assuming you're in a month-to-month, which is a fairly big assumption, you are probably need to give 1 clear month's notice in writing. And so if I gave notice today, it would be effective at the end of next month. Now, if I'm year to year, it gets a lot more gray. At the end of the day, what is important is what industry you're in, because you're going to have to look to the common law to determine what is a reasonable amount of notice. And what's reasonable depends on a pile of factors, as mentioned, one of which is your industry. Generally speaking, the courts are kind of saying 6 months is reasonable, but I don't know that that applies in a COVID world. And particularly, what's a good example? If you're a clothing retailer and you're in a year to year, is 6 months, is it really going to take you that long to get out if your landlord wants to boot you, as opposed to, well, we're a lumber mill rather, and it's going to take us years to move. We don't just go open up shop across the street. So that one is tough to answer. Now, one thing to mention as well is those overholding provisions are usually quite punitive. Where if you time out, not only are you supposed to be in a month-to-month, but often you see 120% rents, 150% rents, even 200% rent is supposed to be paid during that overholding period, because what they really want is they want you to get into another fixed term. Month-to-month doesn't make sense for a lot of reasons for most businesses.
Well, while we're on it, can somebody explain one-day or short-term rentals?
I'm not too sure what the question is there.
Yeah, that's exactly what the question is. So yeah, I mean, short-term rentals in the tourism sector would be considered like Airbnb, weekly, things like that. We're more based on the commercial. So I'm sorry to the person who asked the question. If you're in the room, email me and I'll see if I can get you some more information. How's that one?
Yeah, it might be related to co-working space, so like a Regis type space where you can rent like single offices. I'm not sure.
Sorry, Paul, you were saying?
Yeah, I was struggling with that question as well. I don't really have any experience at all with one-day rentals. Like, are those event rentals? I'm not sure. If we're talking about Regis, then the answer is likely the business owner who's offering these one-day rentals and short-term rentals is going to have their own tailor-made, specific standard form of rental contract. Now, from a legal perspective, there are very important differences between leases and rental agreements. And so something to consider when you're looking at a short-term lease as opposed to a short-term rental are the legal ramifications of the difference. It kind of seems like you're getting the same thing at the end of the day, but you're not. And so a license to occupy or a short-term rental agreement, the hallmarks of that document are going to be looking at how much control the landlord grants to the tenant, and whether that control is generally exclusive or not. So we're renting a room, we're renting a Regis. There's a lot of shared space. I may have a non-exclusive license to occupy that shared space. Or is it, the landlord disappears for a month or a week and I get the space for the whole week? Or rentals for, more likely, I've got it from say 9 to 6. And what happens when I'm not there? It's not my space. So you see the landlord or the lessor, I suppose, retaining a lot more control over the space when it's a rental. And importantly, with a license to occupy is distinguished from a lease. License to occupies are always revocable upon reasonable notice. So if you've got your 9 or your 2-day short-term rental or your 9 to 5, you might not have quite as much time as you think.
You're on mute, Colleen.
Sorry, I'm muted because the dog went hoofing it through the room. I apologize. I actually asked Garth if you had anything to add to that.
No.
Okay. I thought didn't look to see. I apologize. Trying to be good about the muting, but magic wand, or what I like to say, crystal ball moment. If you could change it, how would you improve the CECRA?
Very tough question at this point. I'm still digesting kind of how it's been structured and what they could do. I mean, I think it's initially, if there's a way that they could get a better buy-in from the landlord community by tweaking it, I think that's obviously the clear problem they have with it.
Okay.
From a legal side, I see one concern being the landlord's duty to mitigate. And with that general concept being out there, landlords really shouldn't, as a matter of right, okay, well, I'm just going to discard this because what's the government doing mucking about in my contract? And interestingly enough, as we mentioned, relationships are key. For the most part, if you've got that good relationship, that's probably not how your landlord's going to treat you. And I think age seems to matter with some of our older clients. They're on the landlord side of things. Well, a contract's a contract and pay. Now, if the tenant says, well, I can't, and the landlord, terminates, and we've got this duty to mitigate, well, the landlord's already, I think, and this is me speculating because I haven't seen the program yet, the landlord's going to be running into a tough spot with respect to how much damages they can claim from their tenant, even if their tenant's got all the money and has decided, well, my business is down, I do have all of these assets, and I probably can apply for this, that, and the other program, but you know what? Let's just do this because CECRA is easier. I think, you might be limited to that 25% as a landlord, because that tenant is staring you in the face. They've got the space already. I don't know if you can get much more than that.
And I think part of it too is some landlords have also said to me, it's like I'm being shamed if I don't do it, but I can't afford to do it. I'm in the same boat, so it's interesting. I think one of the first things in Vancouver we found as a chamber world network, very quickly, one very large landlord who shall remain nameless in this conversation, sent out an email to every one of their commercial, residential, every tenant they had, which is over 500 buildings, and said, we will not be participating because of the unanswered questions and the lack of detail. And if they have 500 buildings, let's consider they've got 6 tenants in each building. Let's do the math. They have to do the paperwork. So where's the incentive?
Yeah, I think a lot of the larger developer landlords have also laid off a significant amount of their staff. So processing these applications is obviously a pretty daunting task for the larger groups. And to your point, exactly, like a lot of a lot of landlords in our market develop residential, they develop industrial, they own apartment buildings. So the reputational risk for them, if they're saying no to their tenants, could be quite harmful for, call it, a residential project where your reputation really, really matters, right? So it's an interesting predicament.
Okay, sorry, this question popped up in chat, but Austin, I don't quite have all the question there that I'm seeing. If you were talking, was your question probably was about the 1 day or short-term rentals? Oh. Okay, so the CECRA is also not capturing everybody. That is part of the other problem that we're seeing. It doesn't capture every rental tenant agreement. So he has a suite at Regis. So it's right what we were talking about, Paul. Small, short office space. And that might be part of a loophole that, it's as if these programs have been rolled out so quickly trying to help people, we've found the places where a large portion of businesses and companies don't fit.
Yeah, so I'm looking at the Zoom chat, kind of, which adds a little bit of background to the question. And absolutely, so in that scenario, I would imagine then that Regis is the tenant that ought to be applying for the CECRA with whomever it is that owns the building that Regis is in, and to the extent that they can qualify for the subsidized rental assistance program, they would just have to use their good judgment and manage to get those funds down the line. Say, this is the break that we're receiving, so we'll graciously extend it to you. But it wouldn't be cumulative. I don't think it's additive. And like they say, it doesn't seem to apply to them, and it probably shouldn't.
Yeah.
Yeah, it'd be an interesting situation, similar probably to a sublease situation. If somebody is subleasing a space, the head lease tenant would probably be the group that's qualifying for the benefit, and then it's their, I guess, decision on whether they want to pass that through.
Exactly. And we saw the same situation actually when the province first rolled out the personal rent subsidy. What if you've got 5 or 6 people renting one house together? Each of them are required to pay their portion of the rent. Mm-hmm. Then they made it so that instead of it being to the one property, it was to the people.
Yeah. So, I also think Regis probably would not qualify. I think there's a cap on the business revenue side, and I think they'd be over that size. I think it was $20 million in revenues.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah. I will add it to the list of questions for my BC group as well, as this is one of the topics that we're still working on. As the details are not out, we're still providing details and information federally and provincially. So Austin, I will add that to the list and see if we can find out any more information. Okay. Sorry, close that. I think I've gone through most of the questions. And no problem. Does anybody have another question for the group, or did you guys have something else you wanted to bring up that was that sort of rolled out of something here?
I'm good on my end, but if there's any other questions, happy to chat.
Sam.
Nobody's quick typing, but then it doesn't give you the dots that somebody is typing, so you have to wait a minute. You never know. Just making sure I've gone through all the questions. I live in a 5-story, I think there's 22 on each level, so judgment of people. I think we only had one person move out or in this month, and that's the first time on the beginning of the month that it hasn't been a gong show with the elevators of people moving in and out like crazy. So.
Yeah. I think the general numbers that we've heard are, I want to say it's about 75% of residential tenants have been paying their rent, and about 90% of industrial tenants, 90 to 95. I'm not sure what the retail or office numbers are.
Yeah, in terms of what we're seeing on our side with respect to deferrals or abatements, and it kind of runs the spectrum. From the one side, we've got our old guys saying a deal's a deal, 0%. I'm not deferring anything. Pay me what you owe me or get out. And then on the extreme other side, we've seen 100% abatement in one scenario, which was a fairly unique scenario. We saw a client with a 50% abatement. 50% deferral tends to be about, I'd say, average from what we've seen. And again, it goes down to relationships and your ability to pay. Uh, if you can pay your deferral because really times are tough now, but our business, we're a pub, so just give us the green light and we'll start printing money again. Then we're seeing, okay, yeah, we'll give you a 50% deferral, we'll give you 100% deferral, and when we get back and running, we'll go 110%, 120%, whatever you can manage. In our single tenanted buildings, that's all. What are we going to do with it? It's a pub.
Yeah. You're on mute again.
Double clicked, sorry. It comes down to two. I think number one with that, especially the smaller retail individual spaces, sometimes, the landlord, a lot of times that might be their retirement fund. That monthly mortgage payment is what pays their bills, or the tenant. I came from a small community where half of downtown was owned by individual families that had owned old houses that had been turned into commercial leases and rentals that right now would be, bankrupting both of them if they didn't have the income. So it's hard. And I think as businesses, if we have to, as the rollouts, as we start to expand and see, I think that'll really make a change, because businesses are going to have to look at how many people can I get in the store? How can I manage the being safe, protecting my staff, and managing the space that they have, making sure that they've got enough, are we going to have a decrease in people looking for actual outside the office space after this, or are people going to be able to manage more? It's going to be interesting. I did just get a question sent to me personally. So if a tenant and landlord agree to a deferral or abatement for a set period of time, and there is also a party who is attached to the lease as an indemnifier, but is not the same party as the tenant, should the indemnifier be included in any deferral or abatement agreement? You might want to actually call an actual lawyer, because I don't know that Paul's going to give you straight up advice, but I'll let you do that, Paul.
Absolutely. So thank you for that caveat. I'd say, to answer the question, should, the answer is yes. From whose perspective, though, which is why retaining a lawyer makes sense. If I was the landlord in that scenario and I was looking for legal advice, I'd say, yeah, you know what? You want to take out one of the arguments that might be thrown against you, include the indemnifier, get consent from everyone that has an interest in it, and that way you take an error out of their quiver if they're concerned somewhere down the road that you should have sought my consent. I think from a legal perspective, maybe they don't have to actually do that, but that answer is quite technical, and I don't really feel like getting into it.
Perfect. Thank you for answering that. So crystal ball question again. Do you see a lot of, as we move forward, I know like some of the big box retailers are still not open. Some of them have taken, like, they're still completely closed. They're not trying the online. They're not trying other things. They're just going to hold up and wait. Where small businesses are really rocking to try and get back in, because they're trying to make their rent payments. They're doing everything they can to get everything up and running. Do you see sort of a more smaller store, like medium-sized store kind of lease rental situation versus the giant box stores being part of this, where smaller people can kind of move up? Or do you see this as, we're going to go big box all the way because people need the space?
My personal opinion, and I hope is true, is that I think there's going to be a bit of a sentiment of support local through this. I think events like this tend to bring communities together. So I hope that I hope those businesses kind of thrive once we're out of this.
We're trying. Does anybody have any further questions for the chat box? Any further comments from either of our speakers?
I'm good.
Nope. Thank you both very much for taking the time to come out and help the Langley Chamber provide some insight to our members about various effects of COVID-19 on our businesses, on our leases, we've asked a couple of futuristic questions, things we'd like to see happen. hopefully we get to that point where we are rolling things out and things are massively improving sooner than later, but while remaining safe. Thank you very much on behalf of the Chamber Board and staff for coming out today. We really appreciate you guys' time. Thank you very much. Thanks to everybody who participated, and we'll see you all at our next town hall. We also have coffee and conversations coming up with our elected officials over the next few weeks. So thanks very much, and we'll see you all soon.
Thank you.
Pleasure.